Well, welcome to our annual conference, and we have a very distinguished panel to talk to today, and I think that it's going to be a great afternoon. I won't belabor you with a long introduction. You all know the importance of the topic or you wouldn't be here. And in the audience, I'm told that we have several experts who are, amongst other things, are going to ask some questions from their standpoint, so that should be interesting as well. So I think with that, let's get started. Are you ready to introduce our distinguished group?
Okay, thank you. On a personal note, as a young soldier, teenager, some 70 years ago, I was about 5, I guess. My basic training taught me when the general tells you something to do, you do it. So here we are. Thank you very much, General Gray, for opening up our event today. We distributed material to the audience and the participants, and in a minute I will introduce the panel. The topic today is combating terrorism, national, regional, and global lessons for the next decade and beyond. So, is this okay? First, again, I would like to express my personal appreciation to General Gray, since it is the 20th anniversary, the annual event. I think it's a good moment to express my deep gratitude to General Gray, whose latest book, some of you have seen the information about the early years, 1968 to 75. This is the second volume. Again, on a personal and professional level, I appreciate your inspiration, leadership, guidance, and support the past 20 years. And obviously, we would like to express our appreciation also to Mike Swetnam and the Potomac Institute for their continuing support throughout these years. Especially, I think that we had the opportunity to educate the next generation of students and scholars and soldiers, for that matter, and policymakers. So with that, I would like to introduce our panel in a minute, but before dealing with that, just a footnote. Since it is the 20th anniversary, and I recall 20 years ago when we developed academic relationships, our first seminar was on countering biological terrorist threats and strategies to combat it. At that time, General, I'm sure you recall very vividly your participation, we had Dr. Ken Alibek, who actually was the top Soviet expert in the bio weapon development. And as many of you may know, he decided in 1992 to come to the US, and he had a very rich experience dealing with the Soviet Union facilities that were involved in the offensive biological program at the time. So we had several seminars, and we actually published a few reports and a book. And the question arises today that we, I'm sure, will discuss is the role of Russia, Syria, North Korea, and so forth. So we developed over the years the program in this area, the outgrowth of our earlier work on the nuclear threats. Many other institutions and agencies, government and international institutions were involved in these activities. Now, what I would like to do is to briefly introduce our distinguished panel. It is a great honor for me to introduce a panel that all of them participated at one time or another in our academic work, and 20 years and even beyond. The first speaker is Honorable Guy Roberts. You have the information. I will not go into details, but currently is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs. And I had the great honor to work with him. I'm not sure, maybe 35 years ago, at least over 3 decades ago, when we worked together at the ABA, the Committee on National Security and Intelligence, in his capacity as a lawyer with NATO and various projects related to the biochem, nuclear, and weapons mass destruction, free zones, so forth. So we had the opportunity to collaborate for many, many years. He personifies actually the interdisciplinary approach, the legal issues, international relations, the biological, chemical, nuclear, and so forth. So I think he will be able to present briefly some ideas on that particular topic. And as I mentioned, through the NATO framework with the Center of Excellence to combat terrorism in Turkey, Ankara, and elsewhere, we discussed many of these activities. So Guy Roberts will be the first panelist, to be followed by Professor Rita Colwell, who is a distinguished university professor at the University of Maryland, College Park, and the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health, and also senior fellow at the Potomac Institute and member of the Board of Regents. Again, you do have the bios. She's one of the most prominent experts in this particular field, and we're delighted that we can continue to have her inspiration and guidance on the biological terrorism and preventing chemical terrorism as well. And we published some of her presentations in the past year or two. Our next speaker following her is Carl Gorshman. Again, you have the information in front of you. He is currently the president of the National Endowment for Democracy and formerly a senior counselor to the United States representative to the United Nations. For many decades, he provided leadership and the Endowment for Democracy on many of the issues that we are dealing with today, whether it is fake news or racism, immigration, and the role of democracy to combat terrorism. Last but not least is Professor Marvin Kalb, is the Edward Murrow Professor Emeritus at Harvard University Kennedy School of Government and Senior Advisor to the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting and Non-Resident Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. You do have the information, and in fact, we provided also information on his book. I have a copy of his book, which I will display later on before he speaks. So again, we do have the speakers, and as we indicated, that they would deal with the general issue of state and non-state actors that pose threats to individuals and communities and nations, and some even believe a threat to the very survival of civilization itself. Now, after the presentations, we will have a number of participants in the audience who would like to also ask a question or make a comment. So with that, Guy Roberts, would you like to come up here?
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Yonah. It is a very great pleasure for me to be here and have an opportunity to talk about the work I do and the threats that we face. I'm very appreciative, of course, of the work the Potomac Institute has done in the many, many years, although I wish you hadn't said 35 years. That's kind of a little bit older than I had thought. And General Gray, it's great to see you here again, too. I have to, that's right. I have to admit, though, I was actually a draft dodger. When I was about to be drafted, I joined the Marine Corps to get out of the draft. What can I say? So anyway, again, it is a great opportunity, and it's to be on this panel and talk about a topic that consumes a great deal amount of my time as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Chemical, Nuclear, and Biological Defense Programs. And in that capacity, I do lead an organization that is really responsible for the safety, security, and effectiveness of our nuclear deterrent, developing a spectrum of capabilities to protect the lethality of our forces against the myriad of the nuclear, biological, and chemical threats that we see out there, and ensuring DoD compliance with our nuclear, chemical, and biological treaties and agreements. I don't have a lot of time to discuss in detail, and I can certainly try to answer your questions in our Q&A period afterwards. But I'd like to share with you very briefly the general overview of the threat landscape, some thoughts about the emerging weapons of mass destruction terrorist threat, and the importance of and challenges to our non-proliferation norms, which I would have thought by now would have been strong, durable, international norms against the use of such weapons by whether it be violent extremist organizations, which is what we call terrorists these days, or VEOs, and rogue nations. And those, we define rogue nations by the very fact that they are refusing to accept or comply with those legal prescriptions. Unfortunately, today that norm is under assault, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in a minute. Well, as I look at the strategic threat landscape, it's certainly no exaggeration to say that America and her allies face the most complex, demanding international security situation since the end of the Cold War, one that's fraught with both old and new dangers. For example, we have the rise of ISIS, its evident creation of a chem and bioweapons program, the use of sarin and chlorine weapons in Syria, North Korea, use of VX nerve agent at an international airport in Malaysia, and Russia's assassination of a former member of their Federal Security Service, or FSB, using polonium-210, and then, of course, the most recent assassination attempt using Novichok's, or this fourth-generation unusual type of agent. And by the way, one of the things we talk about in the Defense Department is being innovative, and I never would have thought that Kim Jong-un could be so innovative. I mean, who would have ever thought of a pretty young girl running up and putting her hand on your face, and a few moments later you die of VX poisoning? I never would have thought of that, but there you go. But really, the bottom line is very simple. The WMD, the weapons of mass destruction threat, is real, it's evolving, and have significantly increased from what they were a decade ago. The variety of threats is no longer a static list of restricted chem, bio, or radiological materials. During this revolution, if you will, as a concurrent emergence of dual-use technologies and increased access to shared information, which is lowering the expertise required to harness these technologies for illicit purposes. A few years ago, I was involved in a process of trying to find out, how difficult it would be to get a lab put together. You go on eBay for less than $250,000. You can get a first-class lab from used equipment, none of it of which is controlled. And that's concerning, and it should be. The proliferation of technology, increased ease of access, challenges to our our ability to detect illicit activity, and our limited ability to anticipate how our adversaries might employ WMD, all heighten the risk of unforeseen and unattributable attacks against the U.S. and its allies. Further, the sustained use of chemical weapons in the Middle East and the increasing threat of weapons of mass destruction on the Korean Peninsula not only illustrate the reality of threats we face there, but also undermine the norms that protect civilians and security forces from these type of weapons. The reality is many terrorist groups, including ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Nusra Front, many more, have the resources, the intent, they make no bones about it, the skills and access to potentially acquire these capabilities, and they have publicly expressed their desire and intent to acquire such weapons. Their targets are likely to be diverse, including attacks on small groups of individuals, tactical battlefield attacks on U.S. and allied forces, and those, and as well large-scale attacks with potential to cause hundreds, if not thousands, of injuries or death. Rogue regimes like North Korea and Iran continue to seek out and develop these weapons, as well as, of course, long-range delivery systems, such as ballistic missiles. Pyongyang, for example, has been committed to developing a long-range nuclear-armed missile. We've all seen the reports on that. That is capable of posing a direct threat to the United States. They have also had a long-standing biological weapons capability and biotechnology infrastructure that could support a very active biological weapons program. The intelligence community has also assessed that North Korea has a chemical weapons program and the capability of employing those agents by modifying conventional munitions with these unconventional targeted methods. Meanwhile, again, Iran has not only the ballistic missile program, but also known programs involving the potential of using chemical and biological weapons. As we sit here today, the Syrian regime continues to kill its own citizens, aided by the Russian government. The Assad regime's atrocities in Syria have caused tremendous human suffering. We see this constantly on the news, killing hundreds of thousands of people and driving millions from their homes. Reports continue to emerge that the Assad regime is using chemical weapons to terrorize and kill his own people. Taking these factors into account, the threat of a terrorist using such weapons against the United States and its allies beyond the battlefield is the highest it's ever been and will remain so, in my view, for many years to come. We face powerful adverse trend lines that continue to erode the nonproliferation regimes and continue increasing the likelihood that somehow, someday, somewhere, a terrorist group, violent extremist organizations, if you want to use that term, will get a nuclear weapon and will explode it or destroy one of our cities, which by any measure would be a world-changing event, to be sure. To make sure that doesn't happen, we work closely with our allies and partners to intercept and interdict trafficking in the materials to make such weapons and to reduce the risk of that ever happening. But as one of our national lab directors once said, and I quote, "If you believe it is easy to make an improvised nuclear weapon, you're wrong. But if you believe it is impossible for a terrorist group to make an improvised nuclear bomb, you're dead." Importantly, the willingness of rivals to abandon aggression will largely depend on their perception of U.S. strength, the vitality of our alliances and partnerships, and our collective resolve to the norms and values that we espouse and believe in. In addition to advocating and supporting norms and treaties or conventions to combat the use of WMD by terrorists, that threat, the readiness of our forces and the resilience of our societies are really key. To address these challenges, the Secretary of Defense has prioritized rebuilding military readiness to build a more lethal joint force, strengthening alliance to attract new partners, and reforming the department's business practices for greater performance and affordability to rapidly respond to, among other things, a weapons of mass destruction use or proliferation threat. In support of the Secretary's and the President's goals, my office, one of its top objectives is to dissuade, prevent, or deter state adversaries and these terrorist groups from acquiring and proliferating or using these weapons. And as I look at how we're going to do that in the time ahead, there are a couple of areas of concern that I think require particular collective effort. Since the 9/11 Commission, which predicted that it would be more likely than not that a nuclear weapon would be used by terrorists around the year 2014, thank goodness that never came to be, successive administrations have identified nuclear terrorism as one of the greatest threats. And while that is certainly a nightmare scenario, I'll grant you that, I believe that recent advances in biological sciences has made the possibility of a biological event even more probable and nightmarish. In particular, synthetic biology is one of those key concerns. For those that don't know, synthetic biology is generally defined as the advanced application of engineering principles for biological design, and remains a foundational scientific field of chemical and biological defense. Evolving biotechnologies, most recently the genome editing system known as CRISPR, may provide significant advances in diverse technology areas, ranging from medicine to advanced materials. These new opportunities, however, may also pose potential threats and risks that will need to be continually assessed. This isn't a new issue, not by a long shot. In fact, over the past decade, Department of Defense has been preparing for the possibility of genetically engineered threat agents by developing defensive countermeasures and technologies. Our chemical and biological defense program uses the tools of synthetic biology for the research and development of vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostic assays, and chemical and biological detection technologies. Underscoring the need to recognize and characterize emerging or novel threats, we are investing in bioinformatics to analyze DNA sequence data in deployed laboratories. We are also investing in infrastructure, such as our advanced development and manufacturing facility. It's located down in Florida near Gainesville, which equips the department with the ability to develop medical countermeasures at scale or on a needed basis. We can actually reduce the time of vaccine production by half using the new technologies that we're employing. To be sure, the power of synthetic biology will be key to the development of innovative and beneficial defense programs of the future. But we must also find ways to stop these kinds of terrorists from also taking advantage of these technologies for their own nefarious purposes. And for me, again, this is one of the more nightmare scenarios, and I continue to worry about that. It actually keeps me awake at night, thinking about some of the things that we become aware of. But let me also then say a word about the international legal and political binding norms. Russia's use of military-grade nerve agent in the United Kingdom, which not only violates the Chemical Weapons Convention, but as brazenly flouts the international norms against the use of such weapons. Indeed, any use of a chemical weapon by a state party is a violation of the treaty and the international norms and standards that all members of the treaty promise to uphold. Russia's attack validates a more fundamental concern, and that is that the international norm against chemical weapon use is eroding. This is, in my mind, dangerous and counter to our national vital interests and global stability. Ambassador Ken Ward, who's our ambassador to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, I think summed it up well. He said just last month in response to the Russian denial that they had anything to do with the use of Novichoks, he said, quote, "We are at the edge of a precipice where a new normal and a new era of chemical weapons use is threatening to take hold. It is woefully naive to think that all the evil genie of chemical weapons can be contained in the Syrian Arab Republic. Absent concerted international action, this scourge is spreading. It has already found its way to Iraq, Malaysia, and the United Kingdom," close quote. We must and we need to deter this kind of war, and that requires us to acknowledge who is culpable for perpetuating such a horrendous act and holding all individuals or entities involved accountable. We can only do that, we can only do that by acting together with the international community. In closing, I think what brings us together today is a mutual recognition that weapons of mass destruction threats continue to pose a clear and present danger to our way of life. Terrorist groups pursue them because they believe doing so will give them significant leverage. Our job is to reduce and eliminate any advantage they may seek to gain by either making their threats impotent or convincing them of our ability and our will to impose costs that will outweigh any benefit that they may achieve by using such weapons. Given that our prosperity and global stability are at stake, the importance of modernizing our nuclear deterrent cannot be overstated, nor the value of our investments in developing protective equipment and medical countermeasures for our forces, who represent the lethal backstop to our diplomacy. We cannot afford to be the unready confronting the unthinkable. As we confront the challenge to international norms we fought so long and hard to create and nurture, we must also prepare our forces and our citizenry for the nightmare of WMDUs. We are doing a lot, but much more needs to be done. Let me stop there. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Guy Roberts. You've provided a kind of a worrisome background, and I hope I can provide a little bit of uplift that we are, amongst colleagues, able to do something to begin to deal with the incidents of biological events. I will confine my discussion to microbiological agents. Actually, the use of biology for a weapon of mass destruction goes back centuries to the time when a very simple catapulting of let's say a smallpox-ridden carcass, dead body, over the walls of into a castle grounds has been used as a threat. But we now face, I think, the much more sophisticated and very frightening, insidious capability of biological weaponry where modification of the microorganisms that are normally found in the human body, for example, E. coli, all of us have healthy E. coli in our gut, but by modifying it to insert using CRISPR technology or some of the systems biology techniques to insert properties for pathogenicity into the normal flora and disseminating it represents a very difficult weapon to deal with, because by the time that it's been discovered that this has occurred, we will have many victims in hospitals, and time will be needed to be able to track down source and perpetrator. Let me use the Anthrax incident that occurred right after 9/11. I've described this in the previous talks at the Potomac Institute, and I think the report that was published has some of the details, but let me just review it for you. After the tower's destruction, a few months later, a reporter in Florida received a letter that contained a powder, and he subsequently became seriously ill. But because we didn't have rapid techniques at the time for detection and identification, it took several weeks before it was agreed and understood that it was Bacillus anthracis, and that by that time the victim had sickened severely and died. Other victims also died of anthrax, and it was simply because powders in envelopes had been mailed, and it was not understood, I think, either by the perpetrator or by the rest of us, that the simple process of stamping an envelope in a post office would actually force the powders through the pores of the envelope. Hence, we saw the deaths of several postal workers here in Washington, D.C., and a few other victims. It took us 6 years to track down the source of the anthrax, and that was done by using molecular biology. It was done because the organism that infected the reporter in Florida was isolated, grown in the laboratory, and sequenced. Its DNA was extracted and sequenced so that the individual chemical composition could be ascertained. And the characteristic strain of anthrax then was elucidated, and the identification was made scientifically. The other strains that infected agents were also sequenced, but the FBI, in its tracking down the source of the anthrax, was able to collect samples from a variety of laboratories. I think it essentially collected a sample for almost every laboratory, well, from every known laboratory that carried the agent in their stocks. It was because a team of scientists working together from the various agencies of the federal government, meeting on a weekly basis for 3 years, advising the CIA and the FBI in analyzing the potential sources of the anthrax, that it was determined, I would say, from my perspective, since I chaired the committee that advised the CIA and the FBI, which was a classified committee at the time, that the source of the flask of anthrax, because it had been a collection of anthrax suspensions grown up in different parts of the country in the BSL-4, the ultra containment laboratories. Each of those growth cultures had been put together in order to have a very powerful test strain for the vaccine that was being developed in the laboratory under study. And because mutations had occurred in each of the cultures that had been grown in different parts of the country, and the composite contained all the mutations, we were able definitively to determine the source of the actual material that ended up being distributed as a terrorist agent. Now, I mention this because subsequently, in the time since 2001, many of us, not just the laboratory that I have been operating, but others at University of California, San Francisco, Dr. Charles Chu, others around the country, have been developing a technique whereby we can extract the DNA from any material. It can be soil, water, sputum, cigarette butt, whatever. Extract the DNA and then sequence it. And from the capabilities of bioinformatics, as was mentioned by Secretary Roberts, by determining the sequence, we can very definitively make a very accurate identification of all pathogens that are present in a given sample. So this allows us to have the ability then to track down source with elegant capabilities. It took us 6 years to be able to determine definitively, sufficiently for the FBI to move in on the perpetrator. Unfortunately, we'll never know the details because of the day he was to be arrested, he committed suicide. But it did take 6 years, and the new techniques now allow us to identify within minutes, literally, once the sequence has been established of any given sample, within 10 minutes or 20 minutes using algorithms, artificial intelligence implemented algorithms, we can make the identification accurately, characterize the agent with respect to genes for pathogen properties, for antibiotic resistance, for specific characteristics that make it definitively identifiable. So this provides us now with a very powerful tool to be able to understand, determine, detect, and assign guilt or to a source for given agents. Now, what I think is really important for us to understand is that we have really, in the biological sphere, a multiple-headed threat. One, of course, is the rogue nation and the individual terrorist, but we also have Mother Nature providing organisms in territories of Africa, Asia, Latin America, that we have not been exposed to. And these are the emerging threats that face us. And in a sense, I think that kind of nature terrorism we need to understand because it poses a real threat to society in an epidemic of massive proportions because of the fact that we're naive to that specific organism, whether it's a bacterium, a virus, a fungus, or a parasite. And I think that it's also important for us to understand that there is, as was mentioned by the previous speaker, the capability of genetically engineering microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, that are either benign to make them pathogenic, to render them pathogenic, or to be able to enhance pathogenicity in a way that, let's say, combining antibiotic resistance to a pathogenic microorganism that has properties that are highly invasive. So we have these biological threats to which we really have to, I think, be aware and I think to be attentive to in a way of being prepared. I think that there are, fortunately, for example, the EcoHealth Alliance, which operates out of New York City and I think is funded by several federal agencies, DOD as well as USAID, who have been searching out the hotspots of potential emerging disease threats. For example, they were the team that were able to isolate the agent of SARS originating from bats, and eventually also did the studies that associated with the agent of the camel threat, MERS. So I think by virtue of being able to identify potential hotspots, potential areas of the world where we have a threat that we may not be recognizing right now, I think is very important and very helpful. We also have a major additional threat, and that is in the form of antibiotic resistance. This probably is the most serious threat in the microbiological sphere, because the number of deaths each year simply from antibiotic-resistant microorganisms is much more than the numbers of deaths, let's say, for waterborne diseases in toto. This, I think, is an area of research and, I think, application that is really critical for us to understand the misuse of antibiotics. The tonnage, for example, in agriculture is by far, I think, approximately 80% of all antibiotics used. So I think it's really important for us to understand that we are creating our own threats at the same time. Now, it's really important to be proactive as opposed to reactive. And that's why I'm mentioning the capacity to determine sources of hotspots of emerging infectious diseases, and to identify those potential agents, and to be able to build vaccines now, and also preventive measures, and to do it in a way that we can be very constructive and definitive, as opposed to reacting and then having a lot of victims before you can actually provide a source of protection. The hardest part of dealing with a biothreat is that the perpetrator, if it's a rogue nation, offers a certain set of complexities. But if it's a lone terrorist, a lone actor, it becomes extremely difficult because, as has already been pointed out, and I would add, you don't even really need a $250,000 laboratory. You really could, with a few $100s, be able, well, a few $1,000s, I'll be a little more specific. An individual could actually grow up a sufficient culture of a microorganism that could, as was the case with anthrax, that could cause a very serious public threat in the sense of not just the victims of the infection itself, but also of the massive economic and security ancillary effects that accompany that kind of an act or an event. So I think that the message really that I'm hoping to convey is that, yes, we do have serious biological threats that we need to attend to, and that we really need not to wait until the threat is on us, but we should now not be sitting, as I think we are, but I'm glad to hear that the Defense Department is attuned to it. We really need to be preparing ourselves for the potentiality, which means assuring that we have state laboratories, public health laboratories functioning, that we have a capacity to mobilize quickly in the event of an incident, and that we would have the capability of an informed citizenry who are not terrorized, but who are informed and able to react appropriately and effectively. So I in my brief remarks, and I'll be very happy to take questions, let me just close by saying that I've just mentioned the adverse effects of biological events, but we are at the same time learning a great deal about the microbial world in ourselves and around us, which are highly protective agents. And I think all of us in this room by now will be aware of the fact that we can characterize the microorganisms in our gut, on our skin, in our throats and so forth that are protective. And we can understand both disease and health based on the compositional array of microorganisms. And that in fact, it also turns out that the gut flora of each of us is quite characteristic, and that in itself turns out to be a bioprotective agent in the sense that we have in our gut a very characteristic flora. And if you are from, can't show slides, but if I could, I would. If you're from another country, let's say in Asia or in Europe, you would have a very characteristic gut flora, and that this can be a tool as a bioforensic protective bit of information. So I've just sketched over some of the negative aspects and the warning of biothreats, but also to point out that what we are learning about the microbiological world is also highly protective. So I'll be very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Yonah and General Gray, for inviting me to speak today. Let me note at the beginning that since we're meeting in the National Press Club and talking about terrorism, I want to note that I just got a message that earlier today, 2 journalists were killed in a terrorist attack in Afghanistan. They worked for the RFE-RL. And it just underlines, I think, the intersection between terrorism and the need to maintain a free press. I've been asked to talk about the relationship between terrorism and democracy. And I want to begin by noting that around the time of 9/11, the conventional wisdom, which was expressed by Attorney General John Ashcroft, was that terrorists exploit our openness. He mentioned a captured al-Qaeda training manual and warning that terrorists are told how to use America's freedom as a weapon against us. We published, the National Endowment for Democracy that I run publishes the Journal of Democracy, and in January we published an article by Amichai Megan which challenged that assumption. Megan is an Israeli political scientist at the International Institute for Counterterrorism in Herzliya. His article, entitled "Fighting Terrorism, the Democracy Advantage," used data from the Global Terrorism Database to show that over the past decade, higher quality liberal democracies have experienced fewer terrorist attacks than all other regime types, and that there have also been fewer fatalities connected with these attacks. He calls this the democracy advantage. And I think in what we heard from Secretary Roberts, he sort of touched on this when he said that he talked about the resilience of our societies and the readiness of our forces. And that explains really the 2 reasons, I think, for this so-called democracy advantage. Political openness, and this is something that Megan talks about in his article, political openness and the protection of civil liberties allow grievances to be peacefully and publicly expressed and redressed, and responsiveness to citizen desire for physical safety generates higher rates of life-saving investments in intelligence, infrastructure protection, first responders, social resilience, and specialized medical care. which reduce the incidence of terrorist assaults and make them less deadly when they occur. Megan goes so far in his article to say that against the background of a surge of global terrorism over the past decade, a consolidated, high-quality democracy is increasingly proving to be the best counterterrorism organization known to humanity. Quite a remarkable statement. In a 2006 essay by Alberto Abadi, tried to make the link between regime types and terrorism by stating that it exists in the form of a inverted U, where you have fewer terrorist attacks occurring in both, according to this article from a decade ago, in both full-fledged democracies and strict autocracies, with intermediate regimes being the most vulnerable because they lack both the grievance assuaging and co-optation capacity of liberal democracies and the brutal, no-holds-barred crackdown abilities of hardened autocracies. Yet this, it turns out to be not quite accurate. The Global Terrorism Database does show that over the period of 2002 to 2016, higher quality democracies were less prone to terrorist attacks than all other regime types. Both what the survey calls electoral and minimalist democracies, which are these intermediate regimes, showed a higher rate of increase in terrorist attacks, but the greatest absolute rise in the number of terrorist attacks occurred in the more repressive regimes called multi-party autocracies. The reason for this being that such regimes provide more political space than closed dictatorial systems within which terrorists and their ideological and financial supporters can organize and mobilize, but that they also lack the avenues for any meaningful political access and expression, which is meant to assuage grievances. Significantly, this more recent data also showed that the greatest percentage increase in terrorist attacks during that period occurred in closed autocracies. And this seems to be the case for two reasons. Advanced communications technologies have made it easier for terrorists to generate and exploit strategic opportunities in closed societies, and smartphones and social media make it more difficult for autocratic regimes to conceal and hide terrorist incidents. One of the reasons for that U-curve, possibly at an earlier period, was that the authoritarian regimes just didn't report the terrorist attacks, so you didn't have that entering into the data. I want to talk about just two countries in closing, which may illustrate some aspects of what I've been talking about. First is Egypt. In an article last February in the Washington Post by two Egyptian-American human rights activists, one of them, Aya Hijazi, who is now a democracy fellow at NED and was the one that Trump helped get released a little over a year ago. The article notes that, and I quote, "Sisi's counterterrorism policies, which serve as an important justification for his dictatorship, have created a fertile ground for radicalization." The authors of this article witnessed, in other words, they're talking in first person, witnessed this firsthand during the collective 60 months that we spent in prison in Egypt between 2013 and 2017. We watched the process of radicalization unfold as recruiters for the Islamic State, while jailed themselves, appealed to innocent young prisoners who were facing unjust detainment, harsh sentences, and inhumane conditions. Sisi's heavy-handed crackdown has thus actually contributed to an increased Islamic State presence in Egypt. A study by the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy has found that over Sisi's time in office, despite extensive military and police operations, terror groups are becoming more established and attacks still continue regularly. Not least in an article recently published by the Atlantic Council by the Egyptian judge Youssef Auf, he criticizes the harmful effect of the emergency law now in effect in Egypt, and he writes that all doors are closed before any opposition and political activism. This is indeed a primary factor for the increasing rates of violence and extremism. Now, part of the problem is that security forces are focused on preserving the regime, and in doing so, they target nonviolent political opponents as much or even perhaps more than they do militant groups. And this also means that civil society and dissenting political groups don't have the space to operate, to expand their influence, and to develop politically and organizationally. The result is that if and when another political opening comes in Egypt, as it did in 2011, the nonviolent critics won't be organized and ready to compete politically, so that there will be a repetition of what happened before, the same destructive polarization that existed after the Tahrir Square uprising between the Islamists, who know how to function in the underground and can obviously survive in the underground, and the autocrats. Democracy doesn't just arrive automatically when dictators fall. If Democrats and civil society activists are repressed, atomized, helpless, they can't fill the political vacuum that is created when a dictatorship falls. And that's why I think it's in the interest of fighting terrorism to pressure the Sisi regime to allow space for nonviolent groups to function and to grow. The last word on Tunisia. An accompanying article that we ran in the January issue of the Journal of Democracy with the Megan article warned that even in Tunisia, a relatively democratic success story, the failure to address corruption, unemployment, and inadequate social services dashed hopes for progress that were engendered by the revolution, thereby contributing to disillusionment and grievance-driven radicalism, and the result being that thousands of young people in Tunisia left to join ISIS in Syria and in Iraq. What this means is that a political transition needs to be accompanied by an economic and social transformation. The good news, though, is that the democratic political process is ongoing. It didn't stop a couple of years ago when the survey data that article was based on was taken. The next phase of local governance and decentralization will take place next week with the holding of local elections in Tunisia on May the 6th, which is an important milestone in Tunisia's democratization. These elections will give civil society and ordinary citizens unprecedented opportunities to participate and to make their voices heard. I'm especially pleased to note that 52% of the candidates for local office in Tunisia are under the age of 35. And this will counter, in my view, the appeal of the extremists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yonah. Delighted to be with our fellow panelists, and thank you all for showing up. I'm here essentially to talk about the media and terrorism. How you cover it is one aspect of it, but I want to talk about it, if I may, in a more philosophical way, and try to draw a distinction between the way two civilizations approach an understanding of news, of fact, of opinion. And I want to go back to the Russian Revolution. And when Lenin took over, one of the first things he did was to say that the means of communication were to be in the direct control of the Communist Party. There is to be no democratizing of the idea of information. Information was to be a weapon. It was to be used by the party in order to advance a particular point of view. And that has been the case certainly from 1917 to 1991, and since that time it has been back and forth, and one is not absolutely clear about the degree of freedom of the press that exists in Russia today. I would argue that there's probably less of it than there is freedom of the press. Lenin's idea was that there is to be no romance when it comes to information. It was a weapon of political warfare. And that is the way it has been seen not only by Lenin, but by people who have lived in closed societies, people, generally terrorists, who have a particular point of view which they wish to impose on a society, and they do that by terrorizing people. Lenin said at the very beginning, the definition of terror is to terrorize. That's the point of the operation. And you use what to terrorize? You use information, if that is helpful in your cause. And I remember clearly the first time I arrived in Russia in January of 1956, I rather quickly and oddly made friends with a reporter who worked for Pravda, who had a wonderful sense of humor. He told me very quickly that the Russian, which I knew, the Russian word for truth is Pravda, and there's no truth in Pravda. And then he pointed out that the other major newspaper was Izvestia, which means news, but there's no news in Izvestia. And the whole point of it was, up until this very day, that terrorists use information to advance a political cause. And there are, I said before, civilizational definitions here. For me, as someone, I've been in this line of work for a long time, and I can say with total honesty and total belief in the American way in which journalism is viewed. Journalism is not an instrument of warfare. It is not supposed to be. It is supposed to be a way of communicating information as best you can get it to the American people, and the American people benefit from that information. Something as simple as what is the weather going to be, you can get from a weather forecast, and that is part of the news. But if you begin to think of the news as a weapon, then it has to be used in a certain way. And I can remember easily in the coverage of wars, for example, I never assumed that a bullet, if it was shot at me, would ever hit me. I assumed that the bullet was smart enough to understand that I'm a reporter and I'm only there to cover the news. So if it comes this way, it then goes around and out the other way. And what's interesting to me is that I think up until recent decades, even the people who use journalism to advance their own political ends did understand the value and the importance of a free press, not for them, but also for the opposition. And they would treat reporters most of the time with respect and would understand what it is that the reporter is there to do. Today, reporters are seen by people who live by a terrorist understanding of the world as a warrior, somebody who is involved either in helping your cause or in hurting your cause. And if the judgment be that the reporter is hurting your cause, then it is in your interest to kill the reporter. And in the war in Syria, for example, reporters have not only been kidnapped, they have been beheaded. And what was the point of that? The point of that was to be able to show the beheading of a free press, of a reporter from the West itself, the reporter being a symbol of that and put it out as part of your propaganda. So the reporter then could not expect a bullet to go around him. The reporter now expects to be part of a war. And if the reporter is part of a war, then this has to do as well with the way in which a reporter is seen by, for example, the US government or governments in the Western world. If, as we have heard this afternoon, if the threat is there, and there's no doubt it is, and if we are to meet that threat, wouldn't it make sense to try to advance your interest by using the press in a more intelligent way? The press is not the enemy of freedom. It is the symbol of freedom, in my judgment. And if freedom is to be maintained, and I'm sure we all argue that it should be, what is the best way of doing it? If all of the American people, people all over the world today, walk around with their iPhones and everything, and we're part of a revolution, and in that revolution, the bad guys get it. I'm not sure that we do. I have a feeling that the US government still regards the press with just enough suspicion to put them on the other side of the line rather than on this side of the line. And I would love to be proven wrong and to be shown time and time again that the press is one of the great, not only symbols of democracy, but an asset in the functioning of a democratic system. I think, in closing, that the press ought to be playing a more central role in educating the American people on the dangers of terrorism, and not only think about it in a 10-year framework, but this is going to go on for a long time. It's very much part of our lives even now, and it will be even more so. And we ought to be a little smarter about understanding it. Thank you all very much.
Now we have time for questions. Thank you very much, the panelists, for your insights, really covering a wide range of issues. We have in the audience people with very extensive experience dealing with many of these issues, so I think it would be useful to call on them to make a brief comment or ask a question. I see there Colonel Taylor. Yes, Mike, could you kindly get the mic over there?
Thank you very much indeed for allowing me to take the floor. And thank you so much to the panelists for their insights, which are invaluable, some of whom I've worked with quite closely, like Assistant Secretary Roberts. I'd just like to make a comment, but really request views. And I'm focusing on the first two presentations to do with weapons of mass destruction and terrorism, which is where my expertise come from, having just spent 5 years supporting the Security Council in New York on a particular resolution, which I would like to hear more about, particularly, Guy, from you, if at all possible. I think the 3 points I want to make, one is these amazing advances in science and technology, which both Assistant Secretary Roberts focused on and Professor Colwell also, bring enormous benefits, and you actually alluded to them. And so the management of this balance between the benefits you get, which are not just economic or humanitarian, but they're also benefits for defense. You know, better vaccines, polyvalent vaccines, or rapid diagnostics, which Professor Colwell, which I think is one of the most important areas, both for verification, but also for attribution. The events in Salisbury, the Novichok event, which, by the way, was 200 yards from where I was born, as it happens, nothing to do, no other connection with that incident, but rapid identification, in that case, of an agent and attribution are vital. It was easier with the radiological attack on Litvinenko in London before, because they were able to be identified. So I'd like your comments on that. The second one really is to do with the resolution of the Security Council 1540, which aimed at preventing weapons of mass destruction getting into the hands of terrorists, preventing them manufacturing them, developing them, delivering them. And this is a legally binding instrument on all states, all 93 member states of the United Nations, which needs support. The US has been one of the major supporters of this particular resolution and put money and effort and resources into it. But while I was there, some $4.5 million with a terrific return for it. So I just would like to urge that more investment is put into this with a great return. That's nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. And finally, perhaps to repeat a little bit, but can you see possibilities for investing much more in on-site diagnostics? I heard it stated at a meeting I went to last Friday that some elements, particularly, and I'm quoting somebody else, not me, the public health authorities are still in the flip phone stage and not in the iPhone stage. And there are on-site diagnostic capabilities, as Professor Colwell, you quoted, which can deliver a clear identification in minutes, up to 20 minutes, rather than 10 or 12 days growing something in a petri dish in a laboratory. And it's not being used by the public health authorities here enough, and in other countries too. It's not just a US phenomenon. So those are just some comments without going on too long. Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, let me just say your comments are excellent. You're right to the point. Rapid identification is really critical. And in fact, it has great benefit right now for patients in a hospital or just a visit to a physician. It's now possible to be able to, within 48 hours, to know exactly what infective agent you have, if you have a sore throat or if you have bronchitis or whatever symptom, and what drugs to treat, instead of just trying a drug based on experience. I mean, it's good experience, but to know precisely that you have usually a mixed infection. And we don't get that now. And I think with the rapid identification techniques, we can do that. And I do agree with you wholeheartedly that we need to have the capability of not just detection and identification, characterization, but attribution, to be able to know precisely that it's an agent that very likely can be even tracked to source. And as I mentioned in my talk, even the gut flora, if you have a fecal sample from a terrorist agent who is apprehended and says, oh, I've been in this country 10 years. Well, we now have the data that say, I don't think so, because the patterns have been now accumulating, and we have the data for different countries, and to be able to say yes or no. So there's a lot happening, and I think the investment in diagnostics is really important.
Just briefly, Terry, it's good to see you again, as always. And again, yeah, excellent comments. One is, and I completely agree with my colleague here regarding the attribution side, but I would take a step further, and this is the challenge we're having right now, which is accountability.
Yes.
And compliance. And you know, many years ago, even before the NPT, the BWC, and the CWC existed, Freddie Clay wrote an article about after detection what in Foreign Affairs. And his question was, again, if you don't have the political will to enforce compliance of an international norm, the international norm is not viable and it's no longer relevant. And we are facing that crisis, as Ambassador Ken Ward said in the OPCW, that if we don't, we're at a crossroads as an organization. If we don't hold those people accountable, then the norm no longer exists. as much as we would like it to. But and if the Syrians can get away with using chemical weapons, if Russia can get away from using Novichokes, if all of these things happen, then the norm just will not survive. The question is what to do about it, how to go about doing things, and my concern about the synthetic biology, and I don't know if you saw the article about horsepox
Yes.
and the dangers there of genetic manipulation. Several years ago, we tried to do pre-publication review with the scientific community, and I got my head chopped off for even suggesting something like that. So there is, we need to look for innovative ways to tell if people are using these things for nefarious purposes, because it all totally is dual use. Wonderful science. We're using it, as I mentioned, with our advanced manufacturing development facility down in Florida. We're doing a lot of great things on more rapid detection, analysis, and response. Our protective gear is, again, state-of-the-art. We're still working on new models for that. So there's a tremendous amount of doing. We recognize the threat. Our Chem Bio Defense programs has a budget of $1.2 billion. So we're doing a lot. I don't have time to tell you all, but we are. Thank you.
Yeah, may I ask you, Guy, in terms of the role or responsibility of the so-called international community, is it the leadership of the United Nations or NATO or any other organization on that level?
Well, again, we were very gratified at the OPCW to see a statement by the European Union that made it very clear they condemned the use. They demanded accountability. I think we are building a good groundswell of support for the norm, but we're also facing a very active, what's the word now, false news, but disinformation campaign. Fake news, okay. So, like sometimes I'm living a little bit 35 years ago, sorry. but we are facing a very active campaign that makes it more and more challenging to get an international consensus in the international bodies like the United Nations. We have strong support with NATO. Secretary General's made a very strong statement against this use, but it also gets down to what are the steps we need to take to hold people accountable, to hold the governments that are doing this. And that is the challenge, and it's something that the United States alone cannot do. Thank you.
Okay, George here first. I'm sorry, Norm first, and then we'll go, yeah. Mike.
Thank you, Yonah. Question for Dr. Colwell and also Secretary Roberts, anyone else who would like to jump in. On the subject of bioterrorism specifically, and then within that category, looking at lone actors. So if I can posit two assumptions, one that the traditional national security community or security agencies have a very, very difficult time identifying before the fact a lone actor who is bent on doing something nefarious with biology. Second assumption would be that there's at least a decent chance that individuals who know the person who is bent on something nefarious become aware of behaviors that are alerting or alarming. And so my question then is, any thoughts on how best to engage the international scientific community to make them aware of their ethical responsibility, not only to do no harm themselves, but also to flag someone else whom they become aware might be doing something of concern?
I've been thinking hard about this. It's a very, very difficult consideration to be made. First of all, I think that with the lone actor, it really behooves those who know the individual reasonably well to be able to understand that behavior is really, even for that individual, aberrant. Reporting it is a bit of a problem because it gets difficult, because if you have let's say, a funny uncle who behaves kind of strangely, and if he behaves a little more strangely, and you report him, it's not an easy thing to do. it also has all kinds of ethical implications. However, I think it really depends on the concerned citizen, or what we call in the scientific field citizen scientists, who do report what is very unusual. And then I think it's for the agencies who have to make informed judgment, and if there's sufficient information, then a warrant can be obtained. Now, I think the problem is that we have fallen down on the mental health arena, in the mental health arena. Firstly, we have rightfully emptied several decades ago the snake pit type mental institution, but we did not provide the appropriate care and diagnosis and treatment for the genuinely mentally ill. So that's one very serious problem. I think a second is we really need some sort of ombudsman to whom those reports can be provided, who will have the experience, the knowledge, the understanding to make the appropriate decision. I mean, we can't just have a whole bunch of rogue sheriffs running around. We all know what that means. That, of course, I think goes directly to what my fellow panelists have been discussing. So I think that there's a need for a kind of citizen awareness, but in a professionalized way, so that it's done that assists both the individual being reported and the individual doing the reporting. But I think my colleagues may want to discuss some of the ethical aspects of this.
You hit it very well.
No, that's-
Okay.
She's covered it.
George first, yeah. Right there.
George Nicholson with the Global Special Operations Forces Foundation. Professor Kalb, this is basically for you. I remember over at CSIS, I have a regular series with Bob Schieffer, who chairs it. And a couple of years ago, he said, a difference is I got hired by CBS accidentally. They thought I was somebody else. And he paused and he says, I don't think I'd get hired today, because what's changed in the media, and you go back as a real professional, you were a real journalist, a real newsman. And he said the difference is people are getting hired right now as entertainment. Bill Moyer, about 2 months ago at SICE, said exactly the same thing. What's happened in the news media is people are just looking for entertainment. They're looking for just almost like tabloid journalism. What happened to the days where you had the Salzburgers with the New York Times, you had the Grahams with the Washington Post, you had the Chandlers with the Los Angeles Times. How many people even read anymore? Expect they're going to get their news off of Facebook or Twitter and consider that to be journalism?
I would never disagree with Bill Moyers or Bob Schieffer, and I will not today either. Clearly, journalism today is very different from what it was when I started. I was hired by Ed Murrow, and I don't believe that Murrow could be hired by CBS today, because the standards have radically changed. But the heart and soul of journalism is the same. It is the quest for information that will then be passed on as fairly as possible to the public. And that idea is an old idea, but it has validity today. And listening to my colleagues on the panel, I feel even more so, and forgive me if I even suggest that there may be something political going on here. But if it is so important that we understand the science behind all of weapons of mass destruction, and if we want very much, Professor, to get that word out to the public, people have to understand science. That involves money. That involves a national commitment to do something. I do not sense today that there is on the part of the US government a national commitment to try to understand in the best way the makeup of the weapons of war, and the way in which the public can both understand the problem and in some way or another pass it on from generation or group to another, from one to another. The problem is, in my judgment, acute, because journalism's function is so important today. People can argue about journalism as such, but the fault often rests with the person raising the argument. There are many ways of getting information today, but it takes work. And most people today are lazy. And if you simply pick up your iPhone and get a headline, you think you're informed about something. You're not. You're getting a headline. So it's your responsibility to dig more deeply into a subject. And I think the subject under discussion today is crucially important, obvious. And as a government, we ought to be doing much more. And as a people, we ought to be much more aware of what's going on around the world. I think we're living, for the most part, well, I don't want to go too far, but we're not devoting enough of ourselves to an appreciation of the complexity and the seriousness of what we face.
Yes, please.
Yeah, let me take advantage of that question and what Marvin just said to underline the fact, I talked about the democracy advantage, the advantage of a strong liberal democracy in combating terrorism. But let's face it, democracy is in deep, deep crisis today, and we can't ignore that. There are a lot of reasons for it. Part of the reason for the decline in the media is the rise of social media, where everyone's a journalist and everyone has his or her own truth. This is a serious problem, and it contributes to the rise of populism, which itself is a problem, and it was referred to by Megan, because people who are populist propose instant solutions, easy solutions, not professional solutions that really require the care and attention that can deal with the ethical issues that Professor Colwell raised. And then you have the whole problem of polarization, which contributes to the dysfunction of our government. How do you develop coherent policies if you can't agree upon anything, and if you can't get anything done in our Congress, and that encourages public cynicism? So we have a deep problem. And obviously we're here today to talk about terrorism, but I do believe that there is an intimate relationship between our ability to fight terrorism and the health of our own democratic system. And we have to give very, very serious thought to how we strengthen the resilience of our society, how we educate our people, not just through media, but through our schools, where we don't even educate young people anymore about what our country is all about. Abraham Lincoln once said that there was never a political action that he ever took in his life that was not in some way motivated by those words in the Declaration of Independence about being created equal and so forth. Does anybody believe that anymore? Does anybody understand that? Does anybody know what our country is all about and what it should stand for? How do you counter the cynicism and the ignorance and so forth? If we don't do that, we're going to have much, much more serious problems in dealing with external threats and internal threats. Terrorism is both an external and an internal threat than we would have otherwise. We have to fight to strengthen our democracy.
Yes, Ambassador, right here, please.
Thank you all very much for some very, very good presentations. Am I?
No, you're good.
Am I shining so bright?
There's a light right behind you.
Sorry. Very interesting presentations. Given, though, as I think a couple of you said, that terrorism has been with us for a long time, will be with us for much longer than any of us will be here, and is a very complex entity, if you will, or philosophy. Assistant Secretary Roberts sort of touched on it in his presentation, and each of you came very close to the fence without actually saying it. it's an international, it's a global phenomenon that requires more than just a single. The media has a role to play, science has a role to play, the defense and security institutions have a role to play. But you sort of mentioned one other leg of that chair that's been missing in a lot of the conversations on the issue, and that's the role of diplomacy, the role of our diplomats around the world who know the areas, who sometimes are better aware of situations brewing than even our intelligence agencies because they're in touch with a different group of people, quite often the people who are the springboards of these terrorist groups. What's your view on strengthening the role of American diplomacy and of strengthening international diplomacy, not as a primary tool, but as one of the key tools in this fight? And at this, before you answer, I'd like to say, and I don't think we will ever defeat terrorism because it's a philosophy, and you can kill a philosopher, but you can't kill his belief, of dealing with the organizations and individuals who undertake these acts.
Well, first of all, I agree with you. I mean, the terrorism phenomenon is one that we've seen for centuries, if not longer, and it will be with us. And it's a problem that again is best be dealt with, I think, initially by diplomacy. I mean, we'd much rather have Secretary Pompeo deal with it than Secretary Mattis. And but in order for Secretary Pompeo to have the tools he needs to appropriately address it, we need to make sure that those that would use terrorist acts against us will do a cost-benefit calculus, and hopefully they'll conclude, well, you know, maybe we ought to go the diplomacy route, because we will always end up on the short end of the stick. We will always, the costs will far outweigh the benefits, and we will pay a terrible price if we use that kind of a political tool, because that's what it is, against America, her allies, or her interests. And so it's a combination of, again, to use the vernacular of soft power and hard power, the right tools at the right time in the right place, appropriately and diplomatically addressed, will, I think, give us the best chance to hold that monster at bay, but it will always be there and always be with us. I agree with you. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Diplomacy is important, but I think we need a little bit more than diplomacy. In other words, in staying in contact with what's going on in societies, understanding what's happening. We've developed a capacity over the past, few decades to connect directly with people on the ground in societies who are fighting for what you might call liberal values. And the problem I have with, and I think it's being publicly recognized sometimes with our diplomacy, is that the incentive to find agreements with certain governments leads to a kind of wishful thinking and an excessive hopefulness about the possibility for reaching these agreements. So that today, for example, you have the community of policymakers who have dealt with China over the past several decades, who have come to the conclusion that their basic assumptions were wrong about how to deal with China, that they were too hopeful, that they believed that simply by engaging with China and bringing it into the WTO and to bring it into the international economy, they would somehow liberalize and become a more liberal partner of ours. And I think they've realized that that has not been true, that rather than liberalize, they become even more, and then also the reset with Russia. In other words, if we were in closer touch with people like Liu Xiaobo in China, or with people like Anna Politkovskaya in Russia, both people who were brilliant writers and journalists who died for their beliefs, if we were listening to them a little bit more closely, I think we would have had a more realistic understanding of what we were dealing with the governments we were trying to negotiate with. I'm raising a lot of tough, controversial questions, but fine.
Okay.
I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to leave.
No, actually, couldn't agree with you more, but I would like to sort of make a clarification. What you just addressed was the policymakers, the foreign policymakers, and I found in my 30 years as a diplomat and my 20 years as a soldier before that, is that most people tend to conflate the two. A diplomat is not a policymaker. And my comment was not about having the policymakers, because we got enough of them. I mean, Lord knows every election we get a new crop. Is the diplomats on the ground who don't make the decisions. I would be willing to bet you that we had diplomats in touch with the very people you mentioned and reporting these conversations. It's up to the policymakers how they use that information. My comment was, what's your view on strengthening the ability of putting people on the ground who get the information, who have the conversations, to inform the policymakers, and then we can pray that they will make the right decisions.
No, I agree with that. I agree with that. I just think that in addition to diplomats who are working, in our embassies abroad, in addition to that, we now have a whole large group of people who are, who are operating within societies abroad, connecting with people on the ground and providing training and assistance to them. And that is strengthening our ability to keep our finger on the pulse of other societies. What our policymakers do with the information that is derived thereby is another question. I was only saying that I think if we were in closer touch, and some of the people who might have been diplomats and were in touch with this might have been able to tell us that we were dealing with, regimes that were more entrenched in their really hostile beliefs than we were aware of.
May I just add one more point, please? Many years ago, during the height of the Cold War, I remember very clearly that between the United States and the Soviet Union, there was a very intensive exchange program. Scientists went back and forth. There was scientific as well as academic, journalistic, a whole range of exchanges of people. Students went back and forth. We don't do that much anymore. And if we were to reconstitute a program, a vigorous program of student, academic, journalistic, scientific exchange, you would be able to reach the Russian scientists who are faced with the exact same problems that the American scientists have. And you'd be able to talk to them. But we're not doing that now. And that is part of our problem as well, just to contribute to that.
We have quite a number of people, but we'll get to all of you, so let's begin here. Kyle? Right there.
Thank you. Kyle Olson. I've attended a few of these. I wanted to just put a couple of thoughts out. First of all, thank you to the panel. Remarkable presentations this afternoon. And I'm sorry Guy had to leave because my point really speaks to some of the points there. But Professor Kalb, you just made that point that there was a time when the United States and the Soviet Union exchanged scientists, exchanged ideas, and that broke down many barriers. I would simply say we've been talking about terrorism and weapons of mass destruction, the breakdown of international norms, the rogue states. The point I guess I would make is that many of the norms that we talk about, the establishment of international conventions, the agreements that exist, the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, for example, and others, those were created in a bipolar world. And many of the norms that we established were predicated on the assumption that Moscow and Washington and their allies were going to align, were going to orient, were going to derive mutual benefit. The rise of the rogue states, the rise of terrorist organizations with access to, as Professor Colwell pointed out, increasingly readily available technology, means that old calculus doesn't work anymore. And as we look at reimposing norms, as we look at saying we have international policy or treaties in place and somehow these are not holding the line, they're not holding the line because the world has so dynamically changed in the 15, 20, 30 years since those treaties came into place. I would simply note that Yonah and I have been in discussions about picking up the threads of the discussion on chemical weapons control norms as they apply to both rogue states and terrorism. And I think that one of the issues to look at there is that we're in a new era, and that era needs and calls for new kinds of controls, constraints, and rewards. you could say that the world has changed. To some degree, we've also forgotten. I had a conversation with a guy just 2 years out of graduate school the other day, who has a very responsible position at the Pentagon for counter WMD for one of the service branches. And as we were chatting, he asked me about my background. We shared a few notes. And he said, "Wow, that's really good. I'd like to talk to you more because all of our experts on chemical weapons are dead." Sad to say, the world has changed, and a lot of the knowledge and a lot of the hard-earned scars that drove those decisions are things of the past.
Okay. Any comments? All right, well, we have someone in the back, then we'll come back here.
Hello, my name is Wahid Majur. I'm managing partner at Frontierstan. Sorry. Yeah, my name is Wahid Majur, managing partner at Frontierstan and country expert on Afghanistan. My question is for Mr. Gorshman. You had mentioned that military intervention should be coupled with economic reform programs, and I completely agree with that. Been a big advocate of that within the Pentagon as well. But today in Afghanistan, it's not working. We've spent over $140 billion, more than a Marshall Plan, in Afghanistan. The roads in Kabul are still unpaved. It's the most corrupt country in the world, actually. It's tied for number 2. My question is, what's the future of combating terrorism in Afghanistan when the majority of the country, over 50% of the country, is now under insurgents' influence, and also it's one of the most corrupt countries in the world? What's the future of combating terrorism there? How do we win in Afghanistan? How do we win in that sort of situation when economic reform programs aren't working, and then direct intervention also isn't working? What's the future there? Thank you.
Well, look, you're giving me an extremely difficult, tough question because, it's so hard in a country like Afghanistan, which I don't want to make excuses, but this is a country that has suffered decade after decade. It was a relatively peaceful country, before the Soviets moved in on Afghanistan. And you had this war. It was a war which did a lot of destruction to the society, but then after the war was over, the U.S. simply walked away. We know that, Charlie Wilson and so forth. We walked away, and you had a civil war, and that civil war was utterly devastating. It led to the rise of the Taliban, and then the U.S. went in. And we have to recognize that you can't walk away from these problems and expect that these societies are going to grow and develop. The term nation building is a term that nobody wants to use anymore, and I'm not going to use it because you cannot build a nation from the outside. But there are internal forces there that we have to connect with and we have to support. To have decent elections, to support a private sector, to support a vigorous civil society, to support important international media, to support women's organizations because they've been so utterly isolated and endangered by forces like the Taliban, and to recognize that this is going to be a very, very long-term process and that we can't walk away from it, and that it is also going to need our security support. In other words, some people who look at what my organization does, democracy, don't recognize the need for stability, geopolitical stability. You cannot do the kind of work that we do and build a free press if the U.S. is going to walk away from it from a security standpoint, or allow the people with the arms, the Taliban and their supporters, to feel that they're going to win in the long run, because the America, especially America, but also the Democratic allies, don't have the will to sustain a commitment. So we are going to have to deal with that and understand that there is a way, in my view, to do the kind of work I'm talking about over the long term, but it has to be a real concerted commitment. It's going to take many different types of assets that we have, both security, soft power, training, assistance, and to realize that there are people in Afghanistan who want to fight that corruption. And I think, unfortunately, even during the period where we have been engaged, we didn't do a good enough job connecting with those people. I mean, I haven't been deeply involved, but I did make a trip there a decade ago, and what I saw was that our programs pretty much bypassed a lot of the Afghan groups because we didn't think that they had the capacity to manage large-scale development programs. That's a serious problem. You've got to, you've got to let people grow. You've got to let people learn. You've got to let people, make mistakes and to be with them as they develop. But given what Afghanistan has been through, and the fact that there are people who are still fighting and giving their lives so that they can have a better future, I think we got to stay with those people and recognize that it's going to be a matter of decades.
Okay. We have one here. Mike, we're going to come to.
Hi, I'm Glenn Schweitzer of the National Academies. Having managed scientific exchange programs with the Soviet Union and then Russia for 40 years, and with Iran for the last 20 years, I certainly respond to Marvin's plea, but I'm not optimistic. The hard power arguments carry the day now in Washington. The soft power arguments aren't even heard. The short-term arguments carry the day. The long-term arguments aren't even heard. I think the only way we can pitch it is if we can demonstrably show benefits to the U.S., not to the U.S. from interactions. The bioengagement program we had with Russia 10, 15, 20 years ago was a model for the world. We learned more from them than we've learned from the rest of the world collectively, in my view. And right now, we need them more than ever. Okay, they do have these nasty incidents in Western Europe. It's a handful of people. But there's still millions of people over there who remember, and every day I receive correspondence. Where are you? Well, we're stuck behind a wall.
Well, look, let me just say that the organization that I run has an annual appropriation, which is a line item in the president's budget and in the congressional budget. So we have to talk to members of Congress and make the case for what it is that we do. And in doing so, we understand, and I think there's nothing wrong with this, that we cannot just make the case in terms of idealistic values. In other words, we have to make the connection between human rights, democracy, the rule of law, and our national security interests, our intimate national security interests. And I think, in my view, in the Defense Department, certainly General Mattis has made this very clear, that he appreciates the need for soft power tools, that if you get rid of those, he said, you're just going to have to do more in the hard power area, and you're probably going to fail. We have to think of this, and I think there are many, many people in the Congress who are prepared to buy these arguments, that the United States has a profound national security interest in the support of people around the world who share our values. And if we can find the proper ways to do that, not heavy-handed, not a position from above, but from below, supporting people who share our values and who want, for their own sake, societies based on the rule of law and independent media and so forth, I think we can build a consensus around that. And we can't start from, without recognizing that, there are legitimate, deep national security concerns and interests. The case we have to make is that the kind of work that you want to see is very intimately related to advancing those national security interests.
Okay, Mike here.
Thanks very much. An excellent panel. I'm Mike Kraft, author of a recent book on U.S. counterterrorism from Nixon to Trump. And I'm sorry that Guy had to leave. I had some questions on the countermeasures. So I'll have to direct it to Marvin, an old colleague from we both covered the Senate many years ago. One of the issues with terrorism is one of their goals is to get publicity for their cause, or perhaps more recently to recruit supporters and others, like the beheadings, the television footage, videos of beheadings, etc. And there's been talk off and on over the years of trying to develop some kind of guidelines to try to dampen down some of the more hyped up reporting, especially by the by cable news and the media. Are you aware of any efforts going along these lines now, or is it just a hopeless cause because there's so many competing agencies? I mean, we don't have what the British have, like the D notices, like to try to shut down some reporting when there's a crisis underhand and the police are creeping up behind a place. And another aspect, you talked about the role of the government in terrorism. Now, there's been some stories that I suspect were deliberately leaked. For example, a recent one in the Washington Post about underground storage facilities for antidotes for biological attacks. And before every Olympics game, there seemed to be TV stories about how the host government is preparing with security and showing their security people. Do you consider these kind of stories a legitimate use of the media by the government? I suspect, some of these are prompted by the governments in question.
Yeah, but if underneath what you're getting at is that it would be a good idea for news organizations to cooperate among themselves in order to cover a story as complex as global terrorism, if that be the underlying point, if I understood you right. Yeah, but my experience over the last 30, 40 years is that every time there has been an effort similar to that, not exact, similar, it has failed. And it has failed because sometimes one major news organization refuses to go along with it. I'm going to do it on my own. There is not, in journalism, enough of a camaraderie. I found it remarkable that in the new Pulitzer Prizes that were given out, an indication of the problem of covering American politics was given in the fact that the prize was given to both the New York Times and the Washington Post. The two news organizations that more than any other are leading the effort to find out what is going on in this administration. And other news organizations pick up their lead and they run with it. But if you were to sit down with the two editors of the Times and the Post, which I was privileged to do next door a couple of months ago, they're very good, they're very polite, they're good friends. But if you ask the Times to share something with the Post or the other way around, no. They're not going to do it, and that is a failing now, because if you recognize the enormous importance of the issue, if you put it in domestic political terms with what is happening in the United States, but in a broader sense, the rise of this new populism. A former Secretary of State wrote a book in which she describes it as fascism. I am not going that far, but I am saying there is a huge problem there. And the journalists ought to be able to do a better job of covering it. And maybe collaboration would be one way, but I do not think it's realistic. I see no evidence for that to happen.
Okay, well, right here, Ron, then we'll go to you.
I'm familiar with terrorism, counterterrorism, and science and technology, and many of those issues, but I want to stray off into a different realm that's related. I've spent the last year being able to, been privileged to be able to, in a way, visit some of our maximum security prisons. And so I've spent time with individuals who are serving. Some have been on death row and had their sentences commuted downward. People who run gangs, some of our most violent gangs, assassins, those who have committed some of the most horrific and unimaginable crimes that, civil society has to deal with. And there are a number of constants in what I've observed. I've been able to do this without the benefit of taking notes, and I've told, haven't done that. But, it's stuck with me. But the one thing that strikes me, certainly within these facilities, these are international gangs that are being controlled. They're not just within the facility, and the leaders of many of these gangs will be in these facilities for years, for a lifetime. Some of these people went in at 16 and they're still there. They're 45. So they've risen up through the ranks in an imprisoned environment. The currency in our prisons is fear. That's the control mechanism. Whether it's the staff, the wardens, the inmates themselves. So, and you know, fear and corruption are intimately tied together. So when you talked about corruption earlier, I resonated with that strongly inside that environment. But really my question is, when we talk about terrorism, and we've been thinking about this for a long time, we make a distinction between terrorism and criminal activity. But when I talk to these individuals and I go back to their earliest days as a child and the things that happened to them, as an early child, and this will go to Professor Colwell's issue on behavior, social and behavioral issues, you know, what happens to kids and how that goes through their life, were brutal things, horrible things. It's no surprise there. So the behaviors that go with people, and I imagine this is the same throughout the world. And so my question really is, you know, we make that distinction between criminals and terrorists, but it's artificial. And we kind of know it's artificial. We have our plans, we have our programs because of laws, definitions, regulations, our ability to negotiate with other countries. But again, that's artificial. How does that artificial distinction, and we're seeing the problems now in real time with criminal activities such as Texas shootings, you know, does a law enforcement officer declare it a criminal activity or a terrorist activity? It affects operations. How does this distinction impact real operations, our preparation for the future, and what should be done about it?
Well, you should answer the question.
Yeah.
Guy Roberts.
Yeah. Well, I mean, unfortunately, we don't have time to go into that. You're dealing with tactic, you're dealing with copycats, and so forth. So you do have the link between the criminal organizations and terrorists. The terrorists themselves, obviously, are involved in all kinds of criminal activity aside from what we call insurgency or war or whatever it is. But at any rate, I think we have to leave this to some other time discussion. One more question, and we have to close it because of the time factor. Very quickly.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated the informative information from you. I'm Colonel Abu Zar, military attaché of Sudan. So I'm very weak in English, but at least I can convey my idea to you. Based on the information that I got before, Mr. President Bush, he said that the invasion of Iraq is based on incorrect information. So the collapse of Saddam Hussein is creating, ISIS later in Syria and in other countries. So do we think that we are in the right path or in a right strategy that we can address terrorism in the Middle East, considering that people who forced to flee their countries and lost everything, they created something that in their hearts, oppression, they feel that they are oppression, and this is just a cause of terrorism.
Okay.
Thank you.
We really have to stop and make the closing remarks.
As usual, we have no time for thank you, and I appreciate it. I want to thank the panel very much for great presentations and certainly eloquent answers to the many questions and comments that have been brought up. 65 years ago, I was part of a special operation in Korea that was at that time analyzing and looking at the North Korean methods of using chemical warfare and what it meant. That's terrorism and all these kind of activities have been around a long time. 43 years ago this morning, my fellow Marines and I finished the evacuation of Saigon. It was a very sad day for me in many ways, but I could remember, and I thought about my South Vietnamese allies and what they would have to go through in terms of terrorism and the like. I remember in 1965, in October, south of Da Nang, when a little Vietnamese girl came running up to our lines. She was crying. Her father had been a village chief, one of 1,000 village chiefs that were murdered by the North Vietnamese in 1965 alone. And she came running up crying. Her father had been killed, and the Viet Cong had cut off her arms at the elbows. Not a nice story, but a true fact. And you can go on and on and on. 36 years ago in October, our Beirut bombing occurred. And I mention these things because we're living with it, and terrorism is with us, and as has been said many times, it's going to be with us for a long time. It's a tactic. That's all it is, and it's going to be used by people who don't have the normal capabilities of other larger nations and the like, and it's based on fear, and fear alone. We talked about chemical and biological and nuclear threats, and like, what if, for example, you had all three at once? A dirty bomb in New York, the power grid going out in New England, and somebody popping a chemical here in Washington. The chaos and all of that would be tremendous and the like. And so it's been said a number of times here, education is very important. We need to educate the American people and really the world democracies that have been pointed out. We need to educate them on what this is all about, not just training. In training, for example, you do a different thing between a chemical attack and a biological attack. You just do the opposite. I'm talking about education, what this is all really about. And in terms of journalism and what's been said and the like, we need to incorporate journalism really as part of the overall solution to the threat. The solution is a multidiscipline. There's a finance thing, there's an economic thing here, there's a national and international strategy. There are many, many parts to this, and we've got to do a better job, in my humble opinion, of pulling all this together. We still don't understand very much about the cultures and mores and language and thoughts of the people we're trying to help. In 1956 alone, a fellow named, I've forgotten his name now, wrote a book, The Ugly American. And in fact, President Eisenhower directed the military to read that book. It talked about Laos, but it talked about, again, the cultures, the mores, the languages. We don't know how to look at other nations through their eyes very well. So there's a lot of multi-discipline type thoughts that have to go into a comprehensive, adaptive, forward-thinking strategy on how we counter this threat and deal with terrorism for, as has been said, many, many years. On top of that, though, I'm the eternal optimist, and I think we can do this kind of thing. As President Roosevelt said, the only thing you have to do about fear is worry about fear itself and all that. So we can handle this kind of thing in concert with our international partners and the like. It takes a lot of education to become a democracy, so not all these nations are ready yet for that kind of thought process. So we have to deal with that too. But I hope we don't get pessimistic here. Let's keep being optimistic about it, and let's go forward. Thank you.